telling everybody that our government is shady. But every time I do, my family thinks I'm crazy. The hollow earth, UFOs, aliens invading. Fluoride in the water, they swear skies daily. When I talk about these things, they think I'm crazy. There's no escaping anymore the evil that we're facing. Illuminati mind control, they're sacrificing babies. The end of days, but anyways, my family thinks I'm crazy. That I'm crazy. They really think that I'm crazy. They really think that I'm crazy. My family thinks that I'm crazy.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, here we are back again on the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. And I had to wait for him to take a sip because he is ripe and rearing to go, ready already to podcast. We haven't even started recording yet, and we're already 20 minutes in. The great Brad Lail from the Awakened podcast is back. You can find him on Instagram at the Awakened 33. Is it the Awakened Podcast 33 or Awakened 33 Podcast?
Yeah, the Awakened Podcast 33.
Okay, cool. I knew the 33 was in there somewhere. And last time we were talking, you were on the show, and we talked about the 33rd line of latitude on the Earth, which has a ton of UFO phenomena. Now, as we're recording this, we've got a lot of strange things going on in the country, a lot of mystery drones, UAPs flying over certain areas of the country. And all of that just in the background for a fascinating conversation that we're about to have on the topic of portals. So without further ado, Brad, welcome back to the show. I asked you to give me a briefing on this before we started because I think it's a topic that on its face, you might not necessarily consider it to be as, let's say, pervasive, this portal idea, but I think it connects to a lot more areas of research than we might initially expect. It's not an easy thing to research. You type in portal and all you get is video games and all kinds of other nonsense. So this is going to be an interesting one. Brad, welcome back. Tell the audience a little bit about your show quickly, and then let's get into the topic. Where should we start with this topic of portals?
Yeah, man. Thank you for having me on again. You know, last time we talked about the 33rd parallel. So I kind of lean towards natural earth sciences, or earth sciences and other natural sciences, physics and things like that. But that's kind of where my show has taken. It's that's where the path has gone, I guess you could say. Initially I started getting these kind of like intuition, these like downloads about like, or that's what I would call them, just like knowing or gnosis or whatever you want to call it, about like the 33rd parallel. And that has sort of led me down the path of weirdly talking about physics and plasma science and all these other weird things, man. But I talk a lot about spirituality, paranormal, hidden history, things like that. Basically all the stuff that we all talk about in this community. But I try to focus on the questions of like, where are they coming from? You know, like when we talk about UFOs and things like that, I try to focus on like, where are they coming from? Why are they here? You know, the spiritual conversation of things, rather than just like, ooh, look at that shiny object in the sky. What is that shiny object in the sky? Or, you know, like, where's this, or this Bigfoot? I saw this Bigfoot. And it's like, but nobody is ever asking the questions of like, where are they? Where are they coming from? How do they exist? How do they exist around us and we don't see them and things like that? And they seem to know a lot about us, and they seem to come in and out of our reality. So I started kind of studying this, going down this path of learning all this stuff that, uh, I barely passed. I barely graduated high school. Just taking all the physics courses and things like that. I failed physics a couple times. I had to end up taking biology a couple times just to be able to graduate high school. So learning about this stuff now is a trip, man, because it's like, I definitely didn't know anything about this stuff before these last couple years. But I'm glad I went down the path, because I feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing in this world, and that is talking about these esoteric topics like this that, not a lot of people have really touched on. And also, talking about stuff that maybe people might be afraid to talk about, which is talking about the spiritual aspect of, aliens, UFOs, Bigfoot, cryptids, all the other things. So So that's where we are now, man. I'm like I said, I'm happy to be here with you. You can find me, for those who are listening, you can find me at theawakenedpodcast.com if you want to kind of catch up on the show and follow along with each episode. Each episode sort of builds onto the last episode, so you'll hear a lot about the plasma portal talks over the last 41 or 42 episodes or whatever it's been now. So, and then the penultimate, I guess you could say, plasma portals episode that I just released a couple episodes ago. So yeah. Yeah. So thank you again for having me, Mark. I appreciate it, dude.
Yeah, no. Wonderful to have you back on the show. Where do we begin with the topic as all encompassing as plasma, ether, portals? I mean, we're questioning the very fabric of reality when we depart from what our advanced physics tells us is a sort of, I don't know, chaotic material, haphazard consequence of, chemical alphabet soup, just making the right combination over and over again until we have chimps and humans and all the other things on the earth, right? So it takes a lot of, unpacking to just decompress people from that scientific worldview. We've done that with Mark Gober recently when we talked about his An End to Upside Down Cosmology book, which would probably be a little bit more sympathetic to a conversation about plasma and portals. But yeah, it's something that I think in general, and I tried to bring this up with Mark Gober, the idea of electromagnetism, plasma energy, ether energy, these are concepts that have, for the most part, remained on the fringes of science rather than being, sort of incorporated and embraced by science. So, yeah, I'm excited to get into some strange science, but where do we begin with this?
Well, we can begin where we left off the last time we talked, which was about the 33rd parallel. And since we last talked, which I guess was about, 10 months ago, almost a year ago now, we talked about telluric currents and energy ley lines and things like that. And truthfully, man, as I've been going on these shows talking a lot about the 33rd, I just didn't know really, like I would get questions about it, like what is a ley line and things like that. And honestly, that's a tough question to answer because, like you said a while ago, there's not a lot of science that backs any of this stuff up. And if there is, it's probably controlled by the government because it's a pretty powerful topic. So you're not going to get a lot of information about some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about here today. And I don't have any, I'm not a plasma scientist or anything like that. Like I just told you, I'm not even a scientist graduate from college or anything like that. I barely graduated high school. But, when some of this information comes to you, just kind of follow whatever information is presented, which is what we do. We go down these rabbit holes of continually, digging and digging and digging, and you'll find out what organization is who is running what branch of the government is controlling the funds for this, and that sort of thing. So again, all that stuff. As I started learning more about ley lines and what they are, and finding great books on the topic from many different authors, which I'll send you links to if you'd like. And I think again we talked about it last time. Some of those authors, it just is a puzzle. It's a for the last 12 years, it's been a puzzle piece that I've been trying to put together. I've been trying to figure out like what is all this stuff? What does it all mean? And as I get little pieces of information, I kind of like start forming these. It's like the meme of Charlie, whatever his name is from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where all these like red lines are going, everywhere, and that's kind of what it led to for me with plasma science. So, but I'm standing on the backs of giants, like I told you a while ago, man. I read a book. I had a girl named or a woman named Emily Moyer on the show. I'm sure you guys are familiar with her. She's amazing. We talked about plasma portals in like the 7th episode of my show, and she recommended a book called A New Science of Heaven by Robert Temple. And I took her advice and I bought the book, and it was mind blowing because Robert Temple is a philosophy, or he's a professor of the philosophy of science, and he's been studying plasma science for 40 or 50 years. And he wrote this great book. I got it here, A New Science of Heaven, for those who want to check it out. It has a lot of the stuff I'm talking about now. So a lot of the ideas that I'm talking about have come directly from him. I just kind of take it a little bit further because he is a scientist and he doesn't want to be ostracized by the community. So I would imagine that he is probably taking the ball right to the goal line and just kind of like letting everyone else infer the touchdown, if you will. And so that's kind of what I'm doing here today, man. And I just wanted to again, thank you for letting me come on and talk about this because I feel like with disclosure and all this stuff that's going on, it's probably one of the more important topics that nobody's talking about. And like it's funny because if you watch all these, like I don't watch them anymore, all this disclosure and all this nonsense that they do in Congress, I literally do not watch it because you won't get anything from it ever. What's the term for it again? It's like a limited hangout, where they just kind of talk about certain subjects and stuff. But if you never hear the topic of plasma, you'll never get anything out of that conversation whatsoever. Because plasma is the ether. That's what Aristotle used to call the ether. We have since changed the name from ether to plasma, but that's what that is. And for the last 100 years, scientists have been calling it plasma. And really, it's been more of a newly studied topic the last 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And so there's a lot of groundbreaking science being discovered, which, studying the Kordaluski clouds, which are these plasma clouds that sit between Earth and the sun. And what they're discovering in these clouds is that these clouds are highly intelligent. They're supercomputers. And again, they're just plasma, complex, dusty plasma clouds. And I'll kind of get into that, what that means. But basically, it's plasma that has tried to reform into something. And so far, they've gotten as far, or I say they because it's an intelligent species that these Kordaluski clouds are between Earth and the sun, um, that this is as far as they've gotten. They can't go any farther because the sun keeps kind of dispersing them back into a pool of ions, if you will. And so there is essentially this giant extraterrestrial intelligence between the Earth and the sun that can't form into any life because of the sun, basically. So but all of that's interesting, and all of this is still relatively new. I mean, there was a guy in the 50s who discovered the clouds. His name is Kordaluski. They named the clouds after him, but only recently have they rediscovered, like, oh, he was right. There is an actual plasma cloud out there that's not the ionosphere. It's actually between the ionosphere and the sun. So it's a pretty interesting topic, man, and one that nobody has kind of, jumped into the deep waters on. And that's why I guess I'm happy to take the reins. Like I said, I'm an idiot, dude. I don't know shit about anything. So I'm happy to talk about whatever it is that I feel like I am onto, or whatever it feels like is a right conversation to me with the, in terms of like UFO cryptids and things like that, and the kind, where these things come from, and the underlying matter, or the underlying building blocks, which is plasma. So sorry, I know it's a lot.
No, not a lot. Well said. Good way to put it. And yeah, wow, this book looks incredible. Robert Temple's A New Science of Heaven, which explores the implications of plasma physics. And it argues that plasma is often overlooked, which we've talked about that on the show. Well established fringe, we're all in agreement that they ignore plasma, they ignore ether. Yet, one of the things that I'm seeing here in my study guide, my cyber animas are deep at work here, processing information for me while we're talking. And they've come up with this. It says, Robert Temple proposes that inorganic life forms based on plasma may predate and surpass organic life, and that human consciousness itself might be deeply connected to the plasma processes within the body. So that's fascinating. The fact that plasma might help us understand the actual superstructure that pre-designates organic life. Like this is the blueprint, the what do you call it? Scaffolding, if you will, right?
Yeah, it's the building blocks of life. I mean, a lot of people. First of all, let's kind of go back a little bit. We don't learn what plasma is at all in school. We are always taught solid, liquid, and gas are the three states of matter, but there's actually a fourth state of matter, and that's plasma. And this isn't a new topic though. Only recently has it become more of a subdued topic. Like, let's not talk about this because it broaches the spiritual talk that we're kind of talking about now. And so for forever, I mean, I'm 41 years old. I don't know how old you are, Mark, but like that conversation has been hidden from us. We didn't learn that in school. And you won't learn about that kind of stuff about plasma being the fourth state of matter until you get into MIT and Stanford and all these other places. And that's when you really start kind of delving into what plasma actually is. But for the layman folk out there like me, plasma is the universe is 99% plasma. We are living in the 1% that is not plasma. So that's a pretty profound statement if you think about it, because if and I look at plasma as like and by the way, the sun, lightning, the aurora borealis, there's tons of things out there like plasma in real life that you can look at to show like, oh, that's plasma. You know, everybody's seen the balls, for example, the balls you could touch at Spencer's that shocks your finger whenever you touch it. Those are plasma balls. Interestingly enough, those are made by the Smithsonian. So it's pretty interesting that they're kind of guardians
Do they
of
have
that
some
toy.
sort of patent over that technology? Because
I don't know
that
if
would,
I have
yeah,
to look and see if they have a patent on it, but if you go to like a Target or anywhere like that, you'll see that they're
it's
boxed
branded. Yeah,
by the Smithsonian. The
yeah.
Smithsonian is selling
Well,
that toy.
and when you
So if
say
that tells
that
you anything
when you
about
say that
anything.
that plasma is 99% and we're representing the 1%, that's kind of like saying, we're like the part of the iceberg that's not in the water, right? Like we're looking
Yep.
at an iceberg. We're still a part of that plasma. We're just that 1% expression of physicality, however that's, defined. But again, what I'm getting here from my study cyber animas here, uh, this is my patented technology, by the way. You can't get this anywhere, folks, so don't go searching for it. But yeah, it basically says that the bioplasma body is actually this, like, it's like an overlay. So your what is it called? Your nervous system, all the protons, electrons, the ionic pathways that exist within the body. This is your plasma body, which I mean, that's a fascinating way of looking at it. And you share a good example. Everyone, for the most part, I think in at least in the United States, can relate to seeing one of those, whether in a science classroom or in a Spencer's gift shop or wherever else, a museum possibly. But the other example that's probably a little rarer than that, but more universal, is ball lightning. Ball lightning is essentially what we're looking at is electrified plasma in
Yep.
operating in before our eyes.
Yeah, and I'll get into that in a little bit of what that actually is and where that comes from, if believe it or not. But yeah, I mean, we look at everybody calls plasma the fourth state of matter, but it's actually the first state of matter. And plasma is like the spiritual essence of, it's like the building blocks of those protons, electrons, and ions. So it's just like when you build a house, you can't just build a house out of bricks. Don't come from nowhere. Bricks have to come from somewhere. And so if you look at atoms, they're the blocks. But what makes up the blocks? And to me, that's plasma. And to also to Robert Temple, excuse me. But again, plasma is spiritual because it's not made of any atoms. Physical matter is atomic matter because it's made of whole atoms. So essentially, it's pre-atomic matter. So you could really look at plasma as the first state of matter rather than the fourth state of matter. And I didn't really, I guess, talk about what that is. So like, if you heat a liquid, I'm sorry, excuse me, if you heat a gas, uh, let me take that back even further. If you heat a solid, it becomes a liquid. If you heat a liquid, it becomes a gas. When you heat a gas, it becomes plasma, which is essentially a soup of protons, ions, and free electrons. And so there's just a soup of etheric material just kind of floating around us all the time. and we're kind of like walking through it. We're kind of swimming in it like fish do in the ocean. But again, fish don't really know that they're in water. They're just like swimming around the water. That's kind of what I look at as the ether or plasma, is just this stuff that's always around us, waiting to be formed into something. And yeah, we are the 1% of that physical matter that manifests into what we are. And I'll go into it a little bit later, I guess, but I think that there are, if you think about the spectrum, and we are living in God's light. We are humans, HUE-MAN, human. We are a color being. We are refracted light. We are the color beings of God living in this physical reality. So we are pretty special. We have this pretty special existence in this world, and there's 99% of the spectrum that we cannot see. So we live in this little tiny sliver called the visible spectrum, which is 1%. And to me, that's God's light. To me, the light is the essence of who we are. And we are the photons that have, if I'm kind of going deep in it, I guess already, but like if you look at a light bulb, right? If you look at a 60-watt light bulb, that 60 watts of light only produces about 6% energy or light. And that's kind of what we are. That's probably a good representation of like the physical matter. I'm sorry, the plasmic etheric matter around us, and then the physical matter that we exist in. We are that 6% of light that the light bulb gives off. Well, that other, 90% of the light bulb or whatever it is still exists in that void. And again, we are living in God's light. And I had Paul Stobbs on the show, and he brought up the fact that he thinks that the rainbow that caused, or the rainbow after the flood, was God's way of putting us in this prism of the color spectrum, to where we don't have to interact with the 99%. We don't have to interact with the fallen angels and things like that of this world, or the cryptids. And so we are completely oblivious to that. We can't see 99% of the universe, and we can't hear 99% of the universe around us. So we are living in a very, very special place. We are very particularly gifted and made in God's image in that very way. And so, like, it would make a lot of sense that these aliens and stuff have these hybrid programs that are trying to recreate our life so they can come into this existence. They're jealous of us, essentially. Like, I mean, we're living in this perfect climate, this perfect temperature, where we can think and feel and smell and taste and smoke weed and have sex and do all these amazing things that nobody else in the universe can do. But and that would make a lot of sense when you look at the spiritual warfare of things, right? With the battle between good and evil, with the fallen angels wanting to, when they fell from heaven and they wanted to, sleep with the daughters of men. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, they're kind of like jealous of us. They want to be in this world, and God just won't let them be in this world. So that's where we're at with it. But I didn't really come here to talk too much about that aspect of it. I really wanted to just kind of get the idea of, sort of how I see these things coming into our existence, I guess you could say.
And that would be through plasma, because you
Yeah.
laid it out as, as we heat up a gas, it becomes a plasma.
Yeah.
And I tend to think of things in a sort of copacetic way where everything can be understood through a sort of like telescopic, microscopic, as above, so below, fractal, right? Fractal is really, all those other words were unnecessary. Fractal is what I was going for. But when I think of that, I think of heat and cold, and the sun being the source of life, so to speak, at least in a figurative way. Maybe even being the source of creation, considering what we're talking about with plasma and how that's inherently conscious. But it makes me think of like the spatial relationship, and maybe we're in that denser zone where things are colder, things are denser, because they're further away from that origin of creation, that plasma center. So yeah, it's very fascinating to think that these beings would be jealous of us in our position if they're somehow closer to creation. I mean, are they inherently plasma beings? Is that kind of what you're leaning towards with this connection?
Yeah, man, 100%. They're plasma. Like, I think that the plasma exists, like whenever it forms like this complex dusty plasma, it exists as this super intelligent supercomputer that can think, and it's essentially AI in a way. It can think, and feel, or it can think and all this other stuff. It's super intelligent, super smart, because the Kordalutsky clouds, just like you mentioned earlier with Robert Temple, that he had talked a lot about in his book, they are they have been around. They predate the world, so they are the recorded history of the world. Essentially, they are just sitting there, just recording the history of of our Earth, and so they know technology, right? They know all this stuff, but they exist in the purest plasma form. Well, in their complex plasmas now, but they exist in this form that they can never get out of, and it is just intelligence or consciousness or whatever you want to call it, but it doesn't, again, it can't manifest into this physical world. And that's why I think that they are trying desperately with these hybrid programs and things like that to come into our reality. And for those who don't know, like, a complex dusty plasma is a plasma that contains charged solid or liquid particles or dust, suspended in it. And this complex plasma produces clumping, which creates irregular shapes such as like platonic solids, you know, tetrahedrons, cubes, things like that, and also creates other, excuse me, irregular shapes such as cigar shapes, tic tac shapes, things like that. So, and I say all that because obviously, when we see UFOs, they look like some of these shapes that I'm talking about. They look like cubes, they look like cigars, they look like tic tacs, or whatever the shape they come in. And I think that's because they have formed around. And I say they, I mean the plasma has attached itself to these dust particles that are possibly in the shape of cubes, or possibly in the shape of triangles, or tetrahedrons, or whatever you want to call it. They are possibly in the shape of little grains of rice. So when they clump together and they form along this grain of rice, they kind of form into a like a tic tac UFO, or whatever the shape is that we see. And I think that's why we see so many different shapes of them, of these different UFOs, is because they started off as just these little dust particles, and the plasma, which again is free ions, um I'm sorry, free electrons, positive ions, and they just sort of like are trying, they're electrically charged, they're ionized gas essentially, which is interesting because, like, when the government says, "Oh, it was just swamp gas," they were actually probably telling the truth about that, because it's essentially ionized swamp gas. What it is, that forms into that's constantly kind of sparking and looking to form into something. They're constantly looking at forming a relationship again, forming a bond again, trying to reform into matter. And again, the best way to think about that is when you touch a plasma ball from Spencer's or wherever you go get it from, Target, whatever, that that little purple tendril that hits your finger, that's actually what I'm trying to describe here. It's constantly like shooting and trying to form onto another entity, to form into another entity. And so, under the right circumstances, under the right frequencies, this plasma can kind of vibrate together and start to form a complex plasma, connecting itself to these little dust particles. And that was the whole point of what I was trying to say. But this sort of creates this nonlinearity, which means that these complex plasmas behave in an unpredictable way, and they think like intelligent computers. There's a constant exchange of back and forth between the protons and the electrons, and that back and forth exchange produces a photon. It produces a little dot of light. Again, if you look at that back and forth exchange the same way you look at a light bulb, a 60-watt light bulb, well, that's what I'm talking about there. And that one little photon that comes off that back and forth exchange is is the I guess the process or the end result of that back and forth exchange, if you will. So basically these things are highly intelligent. They're constantly forming, they're constantly thinking, they're constantly trying to reform and recreate life again, and they're in this constant process. Well, they run into this problem because every day when the sun comes out, it disperses them back into a pool of ions in into a soup of all these different particles, like I just mentioned, which, again, positively charged ions, protons, and free electrons. So again, this soup is always around us. It's trying to reform, and it starts off by attaching itself to whatever ions is available, because again, it's electrically charged gas that's kind of flying around or trying to reform. And what it does is it'll form onto anything it can. And so if there's a little speck of dust in the air, it's going to try to form onto that. And that's essentially what happened with these Kordaluski clouds in space. Is they're forming, they're connecting onto dust particles that are sort of flying around in space. But the biggest aspect of all of this, of what I just said, is that they're highly intelligent because of the nonlinearity, because of the unpredictable way that they um, and it's unpredictable because it only interacts with the environment that it's in. It doesn't interact with, like, if you look at a computer, you give it a program, and if this then that, it will continuously run the same program and produce the same result. And so that's sort of a linearity approach. A nonlinearity means that it's complex. It's like whatever the given circumstance is, it changes. It's like the book Danny Do, which is like, if you do this wrong, then it goes this way. If it does this wrong, it goes the other way. Then that's the nonlinearity of it, and that's the supercomputer aspect of it, and that's what supercomputers are doing, and that's what we are currently in the process of creating. So, yeah, man, plasma is like the essence around us. It's the spiritual essence around us, and we are in that physical matter, like I said.
Yeah, it's something that I think is very hard for us to wrap our heads around, maybe because these are superior consciousnesses that can
Yes.
not only communicate with us in ways that we're not commonly used to, but also possibly create entire sub-realities where cryptids, UFOs, and all these other strange things are seen, yet other people, maybe in a relatively short distance away, they're not interacting with this phenomena. Like, it's localized to some degree. And there's another book that I think connects in a way to what we've been talking about. It's called UFO Portals by Nigel Mortimer, the late Nigel Mortimer. I was going to have him on the podcast, and he passed away at the beginning of the year, sadly enough. So
Yeah.
thoughts and prayers to Nigel and his family. His books are still available. People can go and pick those up if they're interested. But yeah, he makes an interesting connection to all of this phenomena and naturally sacred sites. He was an Englishman, so he was in England, focused on this phenomena within the bounds of the UK, and he found a connection between standing stone sites and the Rendlesham Forest event, which that is kind of like the hypothesis of his book. But it kind of connects to this other idea that I heard on the Mysterious Universe podcast. They were talking about lost islands and things like that, and they brought up a advanced mathematical physics or geometry equation called the Riemann hypothesis. And I guess this has been extrapolated into something called like a Riemann field. And essentially, it's a mathematical equation that explains how there could be an infinite amount of curves in a finite dimension. So you'll have like basically a surface that has so many like contorts to it that it ends up having infinite surface space somehow, right? I can't wrap my head around this, but the thought was suggested that the earth itself, the surface of the earth, is somehow more like this than just a static, globe, flat disk, take your pick. Uh, this is a better way to explain it. And I mean, again, way out of my league, possibly out of your league, but
Yeah, for
in
sure.
in a way, I think this could help us understand how these portal areas, these sacred areas, might work. If the physical reality we're in is more like this superstructure with all these folds and bends, maybe there's somehow a way that this plasma can travel from one ripple to another without having to go the physical distance. Um, Again, out of my league, but I thought it might relate to some of this stuff that we're talking about. What does that make you think of while we're on this subject?
Yeah, you mentioned curves, and I think that's what I'm talking about. Because if you look at a linear chart, it goes like this, right? Constantly up. If you keep doing an algorithm, the algorithm will continuously produce a result that goes up. It continuously goes up like a snow ski slope or something like that, right? But the nonlinearity would produce those constant curves because you're getting a constant curveball in life. With everything that happens, there's always a possibility depending on the current situation and the current environment. And so I think that's a pretty important aspect to, what's his name? Nigel Mortimer, who wrote about this. Yeah, I think that I'll look into that for sure because it sounds like he's onto it. Right. And just like with the guy Robert Temple, he kind of like has pieced together things over the last like 100 years, even before that. Like I said, with Aristotle, so he's bringing in information that he's studied and bringing on new information that's come out in the last 15, 20 years about plasma science, and he's kind of connecting the dots on all of this stuff. So but it sounds like this Nigel Mortimer guy is like on the exact same path. But yeah, I think again, man, that it's the essence of who we are. I really do. I think it's I think that's where we start off is in this plasma, and that somehow we have um the interactions between all of these processes that are constantly going on has produced us in some way. And I think that these things are constantly studying us, trying to figure out like what is it that they're doing that they get to live in this reality and that we don't. So, but yeah, man, I got a presentation. If you don't, am I allowed to share anything, man?
Yeah,
Am I
yeah,
allowed to
by
share
all
like a
means.
presentation and show you some things?
Yeah, before you do that, I just wanted to say on quickly on the note of the plasma globe, as they're called. That's the official name for that like novelty item that we were talking about before. It was invented by an MIT scientist and a guy named James Falk, who seems like he's done a lot of other interesting stuff, especially who he's worked with. Walt Disney, Epcot, Times Square, the Franklin Institute. A lot of interesting, he's got an interesting resume. But yeah, anyways, just thought I'd bring that up before we got into your
Well, that's important
presentation.
to note because all these big institutions like that probably know all these secrets, and they're just keeping it from the American public because of really and truthfully, as I start to like understand this stuff, I could kind of see like a national security aspect of it, to be honest with you. And I'll get into that in here in a minute if you don't mind. But
Yeah, sure.
yeah, I would like to
Well,
be able to
and
share something if you don't mind, dude.
yeah, go ahead. And I should point out that Tesla invented the plasma lamp that the plasma globe is based off of. So it
Oh,
was,
nice.
robbed by the deep state essentially. But yeah, you should be able to share your screen.
Yeah, and this is sort of talking about plasmoids, which is different than the complex plasmas. So again, everything starts off as a plasma soup, right? And then it forms together. It's trying to always form life, and then it becomes this complex dusty plasma. And this complex dusty plasma is pretty much invisible to us. We can't see it. It just exists all around us. So when these complex plasmas form, they form in these giant blobs, if you will, and which will explain a lot of things for those in the supernatural and the paranormal world when they see like cloaked entities and things like that. I think that that's what they're seeing. I think they're seeing just like these complex plasmas that are formed together. My mom has seen one of these, believe it or not, at the house I grew up in, and she said, I can't really describe it. It was just a blob, almost like the predator or something like that. And so she has regular interactions, including something that happened in her backyard. Like she saw another UFO. It was like her second one in the last few months or whatever. But so essentially, these things form complex plasmas, and they are constantly looking for a magnetic field to interact with. So this magnetic field is the ley lines that I mentioned on your last episode with you, the 33rd parallel episode. Um, and that ley line basically is like these telluric currents which spin that come out of the earth. So the earth becomes electrically charged and produces a magnetic vortex. And these magnetic fields of energy, and these fields kind of flow out from fissures and volcanoes and different cracks in the earth's, because these interactions happen in the earth's mantle and crust, and so they kind of flow out through volcanic systems and all these other different whatever fissures, glaciers, whatever you want to say. They flow out and they kind of spin along the earth, and they create these ley lines basically. And the reason why the 33rd parallel is a ley line, so to speak, is because it's a warm area of earth that's constantly being warmed by the sun, because it's near the center of the earth, right? So I mean, it's near the equator, and so it's constantly being warmed. But anyways, there was so this all was discovered by a guy named Winston Bostic, who was studying the effects of magnetic fields, the effects of plasma on magnetic fields, and he actually accidentally discovered this. He started shooting with like a little push button plasma gun. I don't even know how you make one of those, but I'm sure it probably wouldn't be too hard. But he is like a push button plasma gun. He would shoot these plasmas through a magnetic field. And what he discovered was that it was actually forming um, a, a donut shape, which you see in the background of this video right here. It forms a torrid or a toroidal donut shape. Electrical plasma blob is the best way to describe it. It's a floating electrical donut that looks like a halo. If you were gonna call it anything, it looks like a halo, right? And he was like, "What the hell is this shit?" And so like he started firing these um, plasmoids or these plasmas at each other into the magnetic field. And what he was discovering, that they were starting to kind of self-organize and self-preserve. And he called it like a self-shaping putty. And what it started to do was like just kind of form into this like hurricane, almost like this little hurricane pattern. And he discovered the more you shot at these different things at each other, the more they form what looks like the flower of life. And although these plasma blobs are coherently formed, they can go through dense matter if it's not there. And so he discovered also that they were transmedium. They could just kind of fly through anything. And this sounds a lot like angels and spiritual beings that we're used to, or ghosts, right? Where they can just go through walls or go through volcanoes or go under the ocean with no problem, wherever the case is. This is a lot. They just go through walls or whatever. This is where that comes from, because I think what we're seeing isn't a ghost, but that's what we call it in this world, but it's actually a plasmoid or complex plasma that's sort of flying around. So let's take it back. So it becomes or plasma becomes with the when it interacts with certain frequencies, like tonal frequencies, it becomes a complex plasma. And then the complex plasma has to interact with a magnetic field in order to become a plasmoid, or this donut shape that I was just talking about, right? So again, it kind of spins into this plasmoid with multiple shot at each other. It kind of spins into this ball. Well, so it's like essentially it becomes a ball of an orb, or ball lightning is essentially what it becomes. And so the more you fire it at each other, the more that you see that these things self-organize and start to form into something. So my theory on the thing that I would add to it is that once these orbs, or once these ball lightnings become formed into an orb or a ball, which again it's just another form of plasmoids that's constantly spinning, that looks like a ball, because um, it's the flower of life that's spinning basically, and so it looks like a ball, right? And it's usually spinning around this whatever dust plasma, I mean, whatever dust it attaches itself to, if it attaches itself to a little square grain of dust, or if it attaches itself to a rice grain of dust, it's going to form into those shapes essentially. And so that's why you always see a cube, with lights kind of spinning around it. That's what that is, in my humble opinion. But yeah, and what these things do is when they become those orbs, they become highly magnetized. And when they become highly magnetized, they're constantly flying around and they're looking for more ions to attach themselves to form into something else. So if there's putrefied remains of dead animals laying by, like a stinking, whatever, a bear or a stinking fox or whatever, you're going to get all these different hybrid looking animals that are created. And I think that's what cryptids are. I think that that's where cryptids come from, because they smell bad and all this stuff, because they're putrefied remains of dead animals. So the best example I can give of this is, like, if this happens in a cold environment like the snow, what you're going to get is a yeti, because it pulls from the putrefied remains of dead animals in the snow. So you're gonna get a monster looking thing that looks like a hairy dead animal, snowy dead animal. So that's the best way to describe that. But this is the visual I tried to put together for this. Again, a plasma becomes a complex plasma, which is caused by frequency, and then it hits a magnetic field or a telluric current, and then it becomes a plasmoid, and then it forms into an orb or a ball lightning, which produces its own magnetic field, and then again pulls from the particles available, putrefied remains, becomes cryptids, UFOs, aliens, whatever thing you want to think of. This is the process for all of it. This is how they come into our existence. And this is why I call it plasma portals, is because they're coming in from whatever etheric reality they live in or they exist in, and they're coming into our reality in this form every day. And again, I'll get into the process of that, how that happens with these sun earth interactions coming up, but I'll let you stop if you want to ask any questions. And oh, by the way, um, this is a complex plasma. For those who are watching, there's a video that of a jellyfish UAP that Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp released that came out from October 2018, that was sent to them from some military guys, of this blob that was flying over a military installation. You couldn't see it with your normal eye, but what you could see it with, like, infrared and things like that. And so this military camera caught it, for lack of better words, caught it on camera flying over this base, which in it of itself was a big to do, because it's a military base. So that in it of itself would be, a felony offense for anybody who released this video. So it was a pretty big deal. But this is what essentially a complex plasma would look like, just floating around looking for a magnetic field to form into a donut or a toroid or toroidal shape. I can never say that word, but this is a plasmoid, by the way. This is a new video I'm pulling up now from Chris Bledsoe. He famously interacts. He wrote a great book called UFO of God. For those who want to check it out, you can check it out. Um, he famously interacts with, like, UAPs and UFOs all the time. So what we just saw was a complex plasma. Well, when these things hit magnetic fields, what you're seeing now is the plasmoid process that I mentioned, how it kind of spins around until it forms into a ball lightning, ball of or an orb or a ball of lightning. And you can see right here in the video, it just turned into a little sphere, which
Yeah.
is an orb. And so that's a plasmoid. And again, it's still not in its full stages. It hasn't formed into our physical matter yet. And this is ball lightning right here. This is a video of ball lightning. And this is an orb that is looking to attach itself to ions that are available to become a cryptid, essentially. And you see it shocking the light, the power lines and things like that. And that's because it's trying to form into something. But I'll stop and let you ask questions if you got questions, man.
Yeah, go back to your the four part or the series of how the plasma, yeah, there we go. This one, yeah. So we've got plasma, which is again heated up gas, right? which
Yep.
becomes
It's which is basically ionized gas, which means it's electric.
right.
It's ready to form into something. It's shocking right
Well,
now.
what's
It's
interesting
flying around
about the
looking to form something.
Bledsoe's property, we've talked to Bledsoe and it's out in the woods, it's out in the country. So something that comes to mind for me, obviously our atmosphere is already filled with gases, but I'm going to assume that most of those gases probably aren't able to be heated up. They probably have higher boiling points, so to speak. But when these, gases are released from the earth in some form or from certain instances, strange instances, this plasma becomes free range, so to speak, starts becoming complex as it gathers up, different particles and just things, microbes and dust and all this different stuff that's like causing friction within the plasma. And then it gets a magnetic field, becomes a plasmoid, and forms into an orb of light or ball lightning. And, again, I'm not trying to like debunk anything by explaining it in this way. Some people might be like, oh, well, you're missing the point. We're trying to, I think what I'm trying to do is bring, a greater understanding to these seem like metaphysical phenomena, and I don't think that's necessarily taking any of the power away spiritually from these experiences, just to understand what's going on structurally, right? So, but that
Right.
video you just showed us of the plasmoid changing, the one over the military base, we've seen that a bunch of times, but the other ones you showed me, yeah, this one from Mr. Bledsoe is very interesting because it does kind of
Yeah.
look like something geometrical is going on there. Like that is not a normal light. There's some sort of process that's happening and it feels like it's like a pattern. Like there's a pattern to that maybe can explain. But when we look at that orb, I've never seen ball lightning like live like that on
It's
film.
crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, how dangerous is that? If you walked over to that, you could die, right? I mean, that'll kill you,
Yeah.
right? Wow. That's
Or
really
or to
impressive.
pass right through you, right? I mean, which is a lot of people. I grew up in the national forest, man, and my older brother's ex-girlfriend, I saw her at a gas station one day, and I asked her, I was like, "Hey, you live in the middle, literally in the middle of the woods in the national forest." I was like, "You ever seen any crazy shit out there?" And she was like, "No." They always say, everybody always says, "No, not really." And then like 20 minutes in the conversation, she was like, "Well, there's this one time where this bat basically flew through her house." And I was like, "What the fuck? That's a pretty big deal. Like a giant ball of light just flies through your house. Like that's a pretty big deal." So I think it's common. I think
It
people see
is.
this all the
Yeah.
time, but they don't know how to probably report it or say it. They just call it like lightning or whatever the case is. But
Well, I've
and
never
that's where the
seen it
term
on
ball lightning comes from.
film.
I think is just people don't know how to explain it.
Yeah, I'd never seen it on film. I never doubted it because it's such a even scientists will tell you, it's a real thing. But there's all these reports going back to like the, Middle Ages of ball lightning and people trying to understand what's going on and the reason why it's come up in paranormal research, excuse me, is cuz to your point, it's often accompanied by strange cryptid sightings. So if this ball lightning, this plasma is gathering up like non-corporeal living organic energy, maybe to our eyes, it forms this like conscious, shapeshifter type being. Maybe it's more definite with something like a Bigfoot or maybe this ball lightning can just straight up imitate a Bigfoot. I mean, this doesn't necessarily have to replace Bigfoot, but it could be, an accompanying phenomena. Because yeah, I think this is strange. And even if this isn't responsible for the cryptids itself being like, every cryptid is a piece of ball lightning, maybe this is indicative of the reality you're in being different somehow, and that's where these cryptids, they're like in those liminal spaces where something like ball lightning is frequent. But again, like we rarely catch these types of cryptids on camera, and maybe this is why, because they're not actually solid physical things. There's some sort of plasma, And the only way we can really see plasma is in instances like this where it's illuminated by, I'm going to assume, the electricity from this train tracks here. Like, I'm sure there's something like a reason why it's floating over the train tracks. Like maybe there's just a lot of current in the ground there from the trains. I don't know, but it's very it's very startling to watch this footage because I'm like,
Yeah.
wow, that could happen to anyone, you know? It's one thing to read about it, it's another thing to see it right in with your own eyes like this.
Well, Chris Bledsoe actually talked about it, I think on Tinfoil Hat, where he said that he saw faces and stuff in these orbs.
Wow.
And I think that that might be the case. I think that we might be seeing spiritual beings or souls in these orbs
Well,
in a
could it
lot of
be
ways
a
whenever
degree?
we see them. There's a place called the Oregon Vortex out in Oregon. Is famous house that's kind of like at the bottom of a hill. That there's some very strange magnetic anomalies that happen there. You can stand on one side of the building and be taller than the person that normally that you're shorter than, and vice versa. There's a guy who takes, excuse me, his point and shoot camera, the point and shoot cameras that we used to take to the clubs back in the day, to take pictures and stuff. He used to take those and go and take pictures around this magnetic vortex in Oregon, and he captured the same thing, but you could only see it with the camera, with the digital camera that he was using, which we don't really have those anymore. Everybody uses their cell phones, but I think that these things can interact with certain camera types, and most of those camera types that we don't have anymore. And interestingly enough, a lot of people reported plasma TVs being haunted, and I think that that's why they stopped producing plasma TVs. There's articles on that. You can look into that if you're interested. But so yeah, I think that these things are definitely spiritual in some way. They're definitely coming in from some sort of etheric reality that's around us at all, that all is around us at all times, that we just can't see. Just imagine that, man. We're in the 1%, and 99% of the known universe can see us and we can't see them. They can interact with us and we can't interact with them. That's a pretty profound thought if you think about it. And again, it makes you really wonder about the spiritual aspect of things, with us being, made in God's image and all that stuff, like I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, I tend to think of things completely differently than I ever did now, thanks to this show. It's made me more of a believer in God and creation, and I
yeah.
think this helps us understand that. One of my favorite books, The Secret History of the World, they talk about the plasma beings that preceded um, human beings, or are basically us before we became physical beings. And this came up on a recent episode that's not released yet, but it will be by the time this episode's released, with Ani Osaru. And Ani and I were talking about this concept, and I brought up the Hieronymus Bosch triptych. Have you ever seen this painting? Do you know which painting I'm talking about by Hieronymus
No,
Bosch?
but yeah, I'll stop the share so you can share it if you'd like.
Yeah, I'll share it. That's a good idea, because I think, from our vantage point of understanding the world of plasma and all this, you might have an interesting take on his artwork. So let me share my screen.
Well, while you're doing that, man, it's interesting that I haven't read through the books of Enoch yet, but but my research has led me to see that Enoch talked a lot about plasma portals in his like all throughout. Like say he mentions portals a lot allegedly throughout the books of Enoch.
All right, can you see that?
It says, yep, there we go.
All right, so this is like his most famous painting here. Oh, come on. There we go. This is the triptych, and I believe it goes 1, 2, 3 rather than 1, 2, 3. Like, we're not reading it left to right the way we would a book. We're reading it from the center to the left, and then this scene on the right hand side here is the final scene. But essentially, this was the Earth when we were all plasma beings, and this is all like the forms and the various. Oh, please don't. Why are we not zooming in? That should have been more seamless than. Look at this. Google's trying to stop us from examining this painting. They're like, no, you can't zoom in. You have to look at it at this ratio. Do you see that? That's crazy. Anyways, I'll find another photo. But what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's just all these complex shapes that we've never seen before, and that's it. That's usually described when people have. I've never had DMT experiences. I've never had near death experiences or any ayahuasca experiences, anything like that. But these are the kinds of like. Now they're not geometric, obviously, that a lot of people experience, but weird shapes that people can't explain, or weird lighting, or realms. And I think that's what we're doing when we go uh, into the etheric realm. That's actually what I think happened with Adam and Eve in the story of eating the forbidden fruit. Is they ate from the fruit, or from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which was the forbidden fruit. They got to see into that realm. They got to peer into that realm, and then they kind of realized like, oh shit, we're like like this is really a spiritual place. And so I think we're in this world for a reason. I think we're in this particular place to experience something, to learn something, to do something. And then um you know because again, when people talk about when they have near death experiences, they go through this process and they meet God and all this stuff, and God asks them like, did you learn how to love? And I think that that's what we're designed to do. I don't think we're designed to see into these kind of worlds that you're showing right now. I think that world, those worlds used to exist with minotaurs and all these different mermaids and stuff like that. But after the flood, just like Paul Staub said, God created, put us in this rainbow or this prism of light to where we can't see the rest of the this nonsense crazy stuff that we're seeing right now on the screen. So
Yeah, this on the left here, this is Christ with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, which
yep.
I don't know. Did Christ visit Adam and Eve? No, right? Christ came after in the Bible, so this is
Yeah,
maybe
but it was God and
right, right. Of course,
before human form, basically.
right.
And Christ is God in human form.
Well, and then this is us now in the material on the right hand side. Um, just chaos. You see, there's like a knife coming out of an ear. There's kind of crazy
That looks like
looking.
a Salvador Dali painting, dude.
Oh yeah, well, Dolly definitely was inspired by Bosch for sure. But yeah, it's fascinating stuff. I mean, art is possibly one of the only ways we can glimpse into that world of plasma, because as you say, yeah, we're not meant to see those things anymore. It's like it's part of our limitations of being in this density, right? I mean, I think this is kind of the ether physics that they want to separate us from, because not understanding this is kind of pivotal to their whole ensnarement of us as physical, not connected beings who are just randomly here in alphabet soup, like I described before.
Yeah, if you look at a plasma ball that we mentioned earlier, and if you don't mind, I'll share my screen one more
Yeah,
time just
go
to show
ahead.
you. Um, if you look at a plasma ball like we're looking at here, all this black stuff, that's the void. That's the etheric world that we can't see. And we're living in like the process that produces the photons that we are, the light beings that we are, is caused in these filaments. There's a back and forth of protons and electrons exchanging light, and the plasma around us, the plasma around these filaments constricts that plasma, and is what actually produces that light. So it's an interesting um complex interaction. And again, so you could see why this etheric world would be jealous of us, right? It's like And oh, by the way, if you look at this plasma ball center, it looks just like a sun. And these lines, these tendrils that are coming off of it are connected to nodes, and these nodes, can be the different planets, which is exactly how the universe looks right now. That if you take modern, the scientific alleged consensus of, how the universe looks and all that stuff, and Robert Temple and other people call it the cosmic web, or cosmic brain, and this is why, because it looks like everything is everything, right? It's like, the one on the left is brain cells, and the one on the right is a galaxy, and they look identical. And so it has this you have this idea that there is, crazy enough, in our brains is a universe, and we're in another brain that's in another brain that's in another brain that's in another brain. So there's these weird, this fractal universe that you mentioned earlier, that we are in, this constant never ending spiral, or up spiral or down spiral, no matter how you look at it. And the reason I had this thought was, I've always thought my whole life, like, oh, everything is everything. Like, lungs look like trees, and a zit looks like a volcano, and like all these different things. Your veins look like rivers and stuff like that. And then, man, I forgot where I was going with that, but essentially, there's this constant thought of mine that, like, everything is everything, and we are these, like, one giant, maybe God figure. Maybe there's this one giant God figure, and then we're all a part of. And that spiral that I mentioned, I remember seeing it. Like, I've been to a lot of places in the Middle East, man. I've been to Egypt and all these different places. And people always think of Egypt as like, oh, they got like three pyramids, the Great Pyramids of Giza and all that stuff. And it's like, well, actually, there's like 190 or 180 pyramids there in Egypt. We just only talk about those three.
Hmm.
And most of those other ones that are there are less focused on and all that stuff, but you still are obviously still governed by the Egyptian archaeological, whatever it is, society, or whatever it is. And but a lot of these places have these spirals painted on the floors, and a lot of these ancient places have that same spiral, and the spiral always has the zodiac signs. And so to me, that represents, like, it's the golden ratio, right? The never ending spiral or fractal of perfectness and things like that. And so that's where I actually think that, um, that's why I say everything is everything, because I think we are God experiencing himself, if that makes any sense. I don't know. I don't know. It's always weird saying stuff like that, because I'm a big Christian too. So I don't really know how to put that. Cause if you put it in any way, somebody who is big Christians, they're going to think you're, blasphemous for saying something like, you're thinking you're God. And it's like, I don't really think I'm God. I just think that I am if you look at God as like this giant ocean, I'm just a little teacup. My body is a teacup, and you just scoop out a little piece of of God out of the ocean. That's what I think of. So I don't really think I'm God. I think that I'm just a fragment of God, or a fractal of God.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything unchristian about that at all. It might just be the fundamentalist Christians who want to, you know, avoid anything mystical. But there's mystical portions of the Bible, and there's whole parts of the Bible that have been taken out. So who knows? Maybe the Nag Hammadi Dead Sea Scrolls, maybe this, uh, explains some of the things that we're talking about here, and they just don't want us to know about it because then they can't put on this whole space war alien facade that's going on right now. This Project Bluebeam, you know, uh, maybe setting up a war was a cover for this alien battle, or maybe the aliens don't exist and they're the cover for a real battle between humans. But anyways, that's a tangent. Don't mind my schizo rant there. Streams of electricity going in and out of the sun. I'm
Yeah,
looking at your
so
slide
just like I
here.
showed on that plasma ball a while ago, where the sun is the center, or if you
Mhm.
look at the center of the plasma ball as the sun, let's just say that this is the center of the plasma ball, this sun. Well, there's streams of electricity going in and out. So the streams of electricity going into the sun is going to cause an induction that forces it to spew out these positively charged protons and ions towards Earth, in the form of like a hurricane or vortex through the geomagnetic lines. So there's these invisible geomagnetic lines that exist, and they exist on Earth too, which we call the energy grid, which Michelle Gibson talks a lot about as well. The energy grid. There's an energy grid in space as well that connects Earth and Sun. I mean, that connects the Earth and the Sun. So if you think about it, if you take a hammer and hit the back of the sun, it's going to shoot a bolt of electricity out, and that electricity is essentially charging towards the Earth, and or in other directions as well. So there's a constant interaction of, you know, the streams of electricity hitting the sun, and the streams of the Earth. I mean, the sun producing these solar winds that come off of it in the form of these energy vortexes or hurricanes or whatever you want to call them. There's a name for them, and I'll get into that in a minute. But again, these the sun and the space between Earth and the sun is filled with plasma. So this causes like the plasma to self constrict into those filaments that I just showed you on the plasma ball, and they form these electrical currents that look sort of similar to like a Ghostbuster stream. When they're capturing the ghost, right? They're capturing that stream is capturing the ghost and taking them into the trap and things like that. Well, that stream is kind of what those filaments look like, and they're like electrical current transmission lines, and they're called Birkeland currents. So, and this is what a Birkeland current looks like, actually, which looks a lot like a double helix DNA, which again, everything is everything. This is where this comes from. So, and here there's another illustration, I guess. All this stuff come from Canva, by the way. You can find these things on Canva very easily. But this is what a Birkeland current would essentially look like coming from the sun, just kind of constantly these tendrils that are constantly charging Earth. Well, there's a very important distinction that happens whenever these tendrils hit the ionosphere, which is actually, people think it's funny, man, because people think that we're in space up there. And like they're like, oh, we got the International Space Station in space and all these different things. We're not in space. We're still in the ionosphere, which is a part of Earth. So there's three tiers of the ionosphere, and we're still in that ionosphere. So we're not actually in deep space when we're in the International Space Station and stuff like that. But these Birkeland currents hit Earth, and again, the Earth creates this in the crust and the mantle. It creates an electrical charge, and that electrical charge creates a magnetic vortex that kind of spins out of the Earth through these different fissures and things like that. This is an illustration I found online of those orange lines that we're seeing here are actually Birkeland currents hitting the Earth, coming through the ionosphere and hitting the Earth, and these currents that you see, these these circles that you see on the globe, they're actually like what I would call the ley lines. And interestingly enough, you could see that the 33rd parallel would be right along the Peterson current. And so that's again where my research has led me, because I was like, there's something more to this. It's not just a line, like a straight line between 33.1 and 33.9. It's more or less like energies that flow along the Earth, kind of like little hurricanes that spin up. And again, this is what ley lines are. And you'll see that the Hall currents are pretty close to where you are up there. So you'll have some natural ley line activity up there as well. So an important part of this, when we look up at the sky during the day, what we're seeing is air glow, and that air glow is created by what I just described, the Birkeland currents interacting with the ionosphere. That ionosphere becomes charged, and it produces a light, and that it produces a blue photon light, basically, and it creates a lot of them, obviously, because it makes the sky blue, because normally we would see black otherwise. And as the sun rotates, so does the ionosphere, and a depressurizing starts to sort of occur. And it's at this moment, which is dusk, when these dense electrical particles of the ionosphere start to relax into a cooled plasma again. Okay, remember what I said earlier about plasma? When it's heated up, it becomes a soup of plasma. And so as the ionosphere starts to go away, So that means that during the day, the light, which is very important to what I'm talking about here, is God's light, the light from the sun, is hitting Earth and creating, dispersing all these plasmas and plasmoids and complex plasmas that exist. They're completely, it's completely dispersing them. But as that sun rotates around the Earth, the ionosphere kind of goes with it. That blue air glow goes with it and becomes less electrically charged. And that's the moment, which is when these entities start to form into our reality. Because that at that moment, the currents are still kind of swirling around the top of the Earth, and before they start to disperse completely, because the obviously the sun is no longer causing the currents. As it starts to disperse, that's when these things can quickly form and hit those magnetic fields and become come into this reality, become an entity essentially. And the reason I mentioned that is because you mentioned stones and all that, how they play. We were talking. You talked a little about that earlier. These stones were built in. You noticed that most of these stone structures, like Stonehenge and all these other places around the world, are usually built in a circular pattern. And I think that the reason they're built in a circular pattern is so they can trap the magnetic currents and kind of spin them into a little an area that these entities can form through. Because I think our ancestors were communicating with these things on a regular basis, because Native Americans and all these other people have built, graveyards and churches and things like that on ley lines, and the reason they did that was specifically to communicate with the dead. That's a real thing that a lot of people don't even really know about, that a lot of these churches and graveyards are actually built on ley lines. And a lot of these stone structures like we see here, um, with Stonehenge, it's in a circular pattern. So I think that these entities were sort of tricking humans into thinking that they were, like relatives and things like that. Because remember, this intelligence lives around us all the time, so they can see us, they watch us, they know our every moves, they know what your favorite pie is that you eat, that your grandma bakes, and things like that. So what they're going to do is they're going to tell people like, oh yeah, Mark, your grandma, I'm your grandma because you love my blueberry pie or whatever it is. And so you can be like, damn, that was really my grandma, man, because nobody else knew that. And so you're going to be tricked into thinking like, let me put all these stone structures up to kind of help these things come into our reality. And so that's where I think a lot of these stones play a role. Now I might be way off on that, but I strongly feel like that's a really good possibility of what was happening, because there is evidence that all these ley lines again were built on churches and things like that. Because remember, like, these things are avoiding light at all time. That's why all these interactions happen at night or at dusk. These people see these orbs and things, and they start to come in typically around dusk. There's a lot of cryptid sightings and stuff around dusk. And then at night, these things are very active at night. Shout out to Vicky Joy for her book. They come out at night. Um, she talks a lot about how they come out at night. This is why, because at night there is no sun, which can disperse them back into a pool of ions. And so what do? They quickly hide out wherever they can. They go in underground bases. They go into underwater submergible bases and things like that. Places that are devoid of the sun, basically places that are black and cold, and that way they can keep their form. And this ties into everything we're talking about with like vampires and all this stuff, right? What are vampires? They a light kills them immediately and things like that. I just saw an episode of the confessionals the other day, with Tony was talking to a guy, and he mentioned, the guy mentioned that he kept cutting on his flashlight. Or he's a British guy, so he called it a torch. And every time he cut the flashlight on, these things would disperse, and then they would reform after the flashlight would go off. And to me, that's why, because the light, which in the spiritual sense can be God's light, disperses these things and sends them back to their etheric world, to where they were. So it's an interesting thought, at least, that I don't think that I've ever heard anybody really talk about. But again, they go underwater, go into underground bases and things like that. And I think that they were working with our government to you know try to get into this reality. I think they know a lot because they're super intelligent, obviously, and they're probably given, different. They probably have a Faustian bargain with our government, giving them information in the form of medicine and scientific discovery and technologies and things like that, and we just let them continue performing hybrid operations and all these other things. I didn't mean to take it to like a crazy to the crazy town, but that's kind of where it leads, man. It's like, well, I mean, it seems like we have somebody assisting these things. And what I think these things are, and I know I'm long-winded here, but I think these things are demons, and I don't think that the angels would be trying to get into this. I think there's definitely a spiritual component to all of this, and there's good and bad. And I don't think that the angels are coming and trying to come into this reality. I think that demons are trying to come into this reality, and that's it. Angels are here to guide us and help us, but I think there were fallen angels who, um, mated with the daughters of men, produced the Nephilim, things like that, and the Nephilim created obviously different hybrids over the years. And I think that those hybrids are sort of relegated to these, national forests and other underground bases and things where, we're working with them in some way to help bring them into reality or whatever the case is. And as long as they keep giving us like how to build or how to do certain medicines or whatever the case is. So
Wow. So now at night, they're no longer plasma, is what I'm gathering. So we can
right.
actually be physically interacting with these beings in certain circumstances. Now, would this also go for places that remain perpetually dark, like let's say a cave, or even, certain parts of the earth remain dark for long periods of time, depending on where they are in relation to the sun, like Alaska and anywhere up north, Sweden. These places have, what do they call it, like a summer of light and a winter of darkness, right? So
Yeah.
this could explain why you have like Wendigo creatures and all these strange, like you mentioned before, the Yeti, certain creatures that reflect that like cold, icy nature of the environment.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is, man. And it would make sense why there's like a no-go zone in Antarctica and places like that. They're probably working with these things in some capacity down in these places.
Wow.
Antarctica, as well as like the Arctic, which we got like Svalbard up there where they store all these seeds and all these different, you know, it's almost like there's an arc for seeds in up in Antarctica. I mean, in the Arctic, and then there's like a vault for like different plant foods and blood and different things like that down in Antarctica. I think it's like it's called like the Ark or something like that. I could be wrong about that. Could be wrong about that for sure. So don't quote me on that. But I remember seeing that somewhere before. But I think that again, if we are the process of the interactions that I just mentioned with the Birkeland currents and the constricting of the filaments and things like that, then what that's going to produce, that constant flow of electromagnetic energy, which is, if you're looking at this slideshow right here, you're looking at the frequency at the top of that, the crest of that wavelength is what produces matter, and everything underneath that, the hill, the dark void that's underneath that hill, is the antimatter. And I think that that's where, like, the upside down from Stranger Things comes into play and all that stuff. And I think that that's what the void is. Where that sliver, that 1% sliver living in this reality, and everything else lives in this void. And Ed Mabry talks about this a lot. We've talked about it on my show as well, that hell is probably actually really cold. And that's in my mind, that's really true, because they live in the electromagnetic spectrum, the frequency that's super slow vibrating. It's cold, it's dark, they're shapeless voids. And so that, when they come into this reality, for example, they're coming in, a lot of people talk about, they see these dark voids, darker than dark, blacker than black and things like that. Well, I think that's what it is, man. They start off, as this dark void, and they're coming into this reality that way through the process I mentioned earlier. But they are the antimatter, and we are that 1% of God's light that is coming through. And that was the whole point of showing this. Again, I mean, I mentioned it, but I mentioned it earlier, but the Bible talks a lot about it. And in one John chapter 1, verse 5, it says, This then is the message which we have heard of him and declare unto you that God is light and in him is no darkness at all. And if you look at the Bible, man, God is light is everywhere in the Bible. And it says it over and over and over and over and over again. And what's interesting, man, is like you'll see echoes of this all throughout pop culture and all throughout history. You'll see the same, Star Wars is what good versus evil, light versus dark, that kind of stuff. I was with my kids at a antique store yesterday, and I was walking around. I found this He-Man book, and on the front of it was the Horde. It said the name of it is the Horde, and I bought it because I was like, I got to talk about this at some point. And the book was about He-Man fighting the darkness, and it talked about just exactly what I explained here with the ionosphere, being on the opposite side. So whatever opposite side of light is, that's where Castle Grayskull is, where He-Man has to fight Skeletor and stuff like that. So there's echoes of all of this, man. And that book in particular talked about beings of light coming in and dispersing these evil ones and stuff like that. So all throughout our life, it's ingrained in us, man. We're afraid of the dark. We're terrified of the dark. That's why we all sleep at night and we go in and hide inside of our houses at night, because I think for hundreds of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of years, we've been hiding in the darkness from these entities. And I think the Horde is being held back in these national forests and things like that, and they're being sort of patrolled, if you will, by dogman and things like that to kind of keep us at bay. And I also think that it's funny because Paul mentioned that on my show, and my neighbor called, or my neighbor and I were talking on the phone, and he was like, "Dude, when Paul was mentioning that on your show, I was thinking about these two movies, and it's weird because Paul mentioned those exact two movies, and one of those movies was Midnight Meat Train, and the other one was Cabin in the Woods or something like that, where essentially these things that live in the national forest were feasting off of us." And so again, that kind of leads me back to what I was saying about like the national forest having like these, um, we have this Faustian bargain with these things, and we're kind of like letting these things happen. If you look at shows like Missing 411, The Hunted, and all these things with David Paulides and or however you say his name, he talks a lot about that too. Is like, it seems like there's government entities that come in and say, "Hey, nothing to see here," and that's kind of where I get that idea from of like a Faustian bargain. Is like when people go missing in the national forest and everything like that, it's like, "Oh, nothing to see here, guys." And he said, what's weird about it is FBI will get involved in all these other SWAT teams and different things, search and rescue teams that you've never seen before. They'll get involved on certain missing cases and stuff like that. And again, I think that's because we probably do have some sort of deal with the devil, if you will, and are giving them people and blood sacrifices and whatever else in exchange for all these technologies I mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Yeah, this is incredible stuff, man. I think you're putting it all together. I'm really stoked the way it's all forming in my mind, especially this idea that hell is cold. I mean, that kind of reflects what the Norse mythology tells us and their whole world tree cosmology, which I think, who knows? Maybe it doesn't seem so Christian, but maybe it's more compatible than we think. But you can keep going with your slide. I only had that brief.
That was it, man.
Oh, okay,
That was
cool.
it, dude. Yeah.
Cool.
Now, I was just wanting to illustrate those points because when we talk about God as light, that's what that means. Like, and that makes a lot of sense when you say the name of Christ, that these things typically disperse or go away, because just the mention of light and love makes these things go away. So it's not just like literally shining a flashlight on them, or burning a fire around them, or whatever the case is, or it's just saying the name of light, which is Christ and which is God, right? Makes them go away. And so I think that's a very interesting aspect of it that is not talked about enough, because God is light is mentioned so much in the Bible in literally every way. I mean, don't put your lantern, your lamp in your house, put it on the hill so everybody can see it. There's all these different amazing verses from the Bible that talks about God as light. So it's interesting. Like, keep fighting darkness with the light is what it says over and over and over again.
Mhm.
And don't fear. Don't be afraid. And that's an important aspect for me because, I was afraid to do this. I was afraid to talk about this shit. Obviously, nobody wants to talk about this kind of stuff. They don't want to be suicided or none of that shit. And if I'm right, I'm right, whatever, then that's, maybe the angle they'll take. But um, I don't know. It worried me at first. And I talked to Tony on his show about the 33rd parallel. And then he was like, just do it, man. Just go for it. Rip the band-aid off and just start fucking talking about it, all this stuff. And I kind of, when he told me that, it was like, I was looking for permission from someone. But ever since then, I feel like I've been protected by God's light, and I've specifically prayed for God's light to protect me from all this darkness, man, because this shit does interact with us and it's around us all the time. I had this moment where I bought these divining rods because I'm going to start doing more going out into the woods and showing these ancient structures that are hidden in the woods in America and stuff like that. And so I bought these divining rods because I saw this guy who was talking about how you can use divining rods to find things, specifically water and stones and other things like that. So I was like, all right, let me buy some. So I bought them, took them out to my yard, and I was like, all right, let me see if this works, because we just built a house, and so I know exactly where the pipe that has water running through it was buried. So I took the divining rods and I walked over to where the water was, and as soon as I walked over to the water, it crossed. And so I was like, oh, that was crazy, right? So I backed up, walked across it again, and it crossed right at the where the water source was. And so I was like, that was really cool. I went and got my son. I got my 9-year-old son to do it, and he did it. And he was like, "Oh, that's crazy. I didn't know that you could do that and all that stuff." And so I'm standing there with the things. I'm facing my house, and to my left is where the pipe of water is. And I was like, he said something along the lines of, that's demonic. And I was like, oh, maybe it is, man. I don't know. And so I asked it a question. I said, where's the water at? And these things, I swear to God, dude, they went like pointed straight to the left to where the water was. And I was like, oh my God. And so me and my son were kind of freaked out. And I was like, when he said it, it was demonic. I asked the question. I was like, is this good? Are these good forces? And it opened up as if to say no. And so I said, so are bad entities around me? And it crossed and said yes. So I immediately threw the fucking things in the trash can. I pulled tight the Glad bag and threw it in the back of the truck and took it straight to the dumpster, dude. And I was like, that shit's in the landfill now. I don't want nothing to do with these crazy divining rods or anything like that. But the point of that was to illustrate the fact that there are bad entities around us all the time. There's bad energy around us that we just can't see. And these things interact with us in every way. And I think my theory on it is that they are coming through electronics in every way. They exist in these slow radio waves and microwaves and all these things, which is where these communications go through when we talk on podcasts or phones or whatever. They go out of our phones and into the spiritual world, and then they come back into our world. So I think that they can control a lot of shit in these worlds, basically. And so they can affect cameras, they can affect cell phones, all kind of different things. That's why we never have really good photos or videos of them and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm curious about the divining rods though. So you throw them away. How do you address the entities that are still around you? Did you take any measures? Praying? Okay.
Yep. I prayed immediately. Yeah. I asked God because what I felt like I did was I had already prayed for this like sort of bubble of light around my family and then around my property and around my extended family and things like that to like not let anything in. And whenever I did that, I feel like I opened the door and I was like immediately realized like maybe I opened the door to something here. So I prayed that the door would close and protect us with that light again and things like that. Because I think everything is about consent in this world, you know, everything, it's Vicky Joy Anderson talks about it a lot. They're legal entities. They're a very legal bunch. You have to give them permission to do everything. You have to invite them into your house, just like the vampires we talked about. And it goes the same with Christ. You have to invite Christ into your heart. So everything is about free will and consent. And so what I did by interacting with those divining rods was like maybe I gave consent to come into my house. And that's why I prayed it out and told it to get the fuck out of here, and prayed that God would protect me and my family with that light again. And I really prayed hard and seriously about that. So I hope it worked, and I pray that it worked. So
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. It just seems to me like the divining rods weren't necessarily the problem. It's the entities, like, the fact that they even answered correctly, at least they're honest with you, to your point about them being legal,
Yep.
and needing consent. Like, your divining rods were like a way of communicating with them. That's interesting. Do you think that something like divining rods, given that what we're talking about is plasma based consciousness, ourselves, these entities, light is somehow part of this, but as you mentioned, God is light, right? So I think there's a spectrum, right? The further you are from the light, maybe the more negative you act, right? These entities in particular. But the divining rods, could you possibly use them for a positive end? Like, maybe finding water because you're thirsty and you need water. Like, I'm curious where because see, all the entities being around, sure, that's not great. But yeah, I don't see how that affects the water and needing water, right? Like, seems like a pretty neat thing to be able to use divining rods. Is that maybe a step too far for your faith, and maybe that's something you don't want to mess with? That's something that it doesn't jive with you. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Well, I think that when you ask the spirit world for something and they give it to you, you have to be more concerned with the fact that now you owe them, right? Now you owe them something. And that's what I was saying about you know, the very legal bunch is that if you get some form of knowledge that you weren't supposed to have, if you weren't, if you, like there's a guy who hunts for treasure with these things. And actually, the Appalachian Intelligence guys, I talked to them about it a little bit too. I said, hey, man, like they use the divining rods on a map to help them pinpoint where some lost treasure was and stuff, and or at least a region of it. And I reminded them, like, hey, man, maybe we're not supposed to know where none of this stuff is. Maybe God gave us everything that we're supposed to have already. And if we're asking for extra, then we're crossing into the because I don't think that success comes or like if you have an abundance of something, I don't think it's good to have that. I think you have to give that stuff away. And so I think that when we get more than what we're given by God, if we don't give that away, then it can manifest into something else where we're owing something to whatever gave us that. If we go into the DMT realm over and over and over and these things reveal something to you, I feel like maybe you start to owe them in some way. And that's when they kind of come and possess your body. That's when they come and, you know, abduct you and things like that and try to create hybrids with them and stuff like that. I think that again, you have to do something for them after they do something for you. So, and that comes from, just being content with what you have and not trying to have too much. If you do have too much of something, like I said, give it away. That makes God way more happier. And then you continue to get stuff in your life to sustain you. You'll always get money right when you need it. You'll always get food right when you need it. God will never let you go without. That's kind of how I see things. And that's kind of how I live my life, to be honest with you. Like I don't like to have an abundance of things. I try to give it away whenever I possibly can, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm inspired by that. Look at me over here, a glutton of books. Maybe I should give some
Me
of them
too, dude.
away. Maybe I am on this podcast. Maybe not everyone can spend the time to read a book. So this is my way of giving back. Who knows? That might be too.
Yeah, but you're doing it through this podcast, dude. You're talking about stuff.
Yeah,
You're sharing knowledge that
yeah,
people don't have to read these books.
yeah.
So
But is that humble of me? I don't know. Maybe I should donate some of them. But either way, I appreciate that sentiment, and I've never had any success with divining rods, and I don't know, maybe that's because I'm spiritually dense, maybe whatever particular entities have accumulated around me don't want me to know what's going on. Who knows? But I've never had success with divining rods, and never really had any success with really any sort of magical venture beyond prayer. When I was younger, I did sort of, I mean, it depends. The line between what's magic and what's not is blurry. But when I was younger and more naive, I did play around with like the idea of like a spell and things like this. And I'll tell you what, it came back and bit me in the butt in some pretty major ways. So I stopped playing around with any of that. And that's what made me really fascinated in all this stuff, because I was like, well, if I could pull that off, then what are these elites doing? What are these, major institutions doing with this, reality bending ability that, on a small level I experienced? And I think understanding how these plasma forces work is probably a way that we can become aware of how to defend ourselves from these phenomena and from this manipulation. Because I think there's an inherency to all of this, truly. When it comes to these uh, plasma phenomena, it's literally at the heart of everything. As you're saying, 99% of our reality is plasma. So it's not just limited to cryptids and things. Maybe this world of hallucinations that people go into when they're on DMT, or take your pick of some other drug. Maybe it has to do with the uncoupling of our plasma body into this world that's not quite safe for us, because we're just, I don't know, who knows? Again, I don't want to color it with my own biases and give people the wrong impression, because I don't really know what to think of it. But when it comes to portals, I grabbed one of my books behind me for a moment. It's like an etymology book. It doesn't have the word portal in it as its own word, but portal is included in the term port, which I guess obviously portal and port are connected. But yeah, the original meaning of port was to give passage. And then there's another Latin meaning, which means to carry. But I find that giving passage kind of question, obviously gates, doors, these are things that we pass through. But the way you described the plasma cooling as the sun sets, and this is kind of like as the gateway opens, all these beings densify into the night realm. I mean, wow, that's fascinating, spectacular, and terrifying. Something that I think people can hopefully use to their advantage in understanding what's really going on out there. Again, plasma is a transmedium substance. Is that how we would describe it? Because it's able to take on a solid form, a gaseous form, and an ethereal form, which apparently can do more than a gas, which is, gas can't pass through a solid object, right? Or maybe it can, certain depending on the density of the object, I guess it could. But yeah, it can phase right through solid objects, which is also something we see with these paranormal phenomena. So yeah, really strange stuff, man. I had some portal connections that I wanted to make, but we kind of went in a different direction than I expected, which is fine. But have you ever heard of the wing makers? You ever heard of this conspiracy theory, or
No,
the Neruda interviews?
no, I have not.
So apparently, there's a place in New Mexico, like an ancient Native American civilization, remnants of a civilization, and it's like it's shaped like a bow, like a as in a bow and arrow. So it's like a sort of like a half moon shape almost. And apparently, I don't know how true this is. This story has sort of Corey Good vibes, but or David Wilcock vibes, but it goes something like this. This team of scientists found some advanced technology, something that looked like a compass with like hieroglyphics on it, and they found these chambers underneath this site, 23 chambers, and each chamber had a different like symbol painted on the wall, and some of these symbols kind of look like portals.
Yeah,
It's very strange stuff.
every time, every
you
time, dude. There's always like these portal markers. Like you'll see it on petroglyphs. You'll see like these little spirals, and that's typically just marking where these magnetic vortices are forming after the telluric currents produce it from the earth. There's always flowing water nearby to kind of give you an idea. There's always volcanoes or dead volcanoes nearby. Um, Typically these sites. So anytime somebody, like the first thing I ask somebody, that when somebody says, I had a paranormal experience, I'm like, were you near water? And they go, yeah. Like even if it's just a water fountain flowing or whatever it is, there's always like a water aspect to it. So, and there's also electricity. Yep, that's 100%. There's the spirals you see on the outer rims of that symbol of that drawing, the circles, those the hurricane looking
This
spirals.
is a painting. It's like
That
a
is
recreation of what they saw inside the chambers. But yeah, wait, what were you? Which the spirals?
if you go
here?
down to the middle, right there where your hand is. Yep.
Yeah, and then up here too. Okay, yeah, we
Yep.
do see those. And you're saying that these are all over the ancient world as far
Everywhere.
as these ancient sites go. You'll find these spiral
Yep.
formations. Wow. So yeah, I got a little bit of a David Wilcock vibe from this whole story. If you're familiar with that whole thing, a little sensational, but these are apparently recreations of what they saw inside of the individual chambers. These different symbols, and it just made me think of portals. So when we were planning on having this conversation, I thought, oh, maybe I'll bring this up. I don't know. Again, these paintings seem a little too southwestern, modern for me to think that this would all be on some, petroglyph, but it's a recreation, so who knows how accurate this is to what's actually inside the cave. But yeah, this is clearly some sort of portal, this whole
Yeah.
shape here.
I think there's also people who are worshiping the things that come out of these portals.
It's kind of what it looks like, right? Like these guys are like up here, like making song
Look,
and
okay,
dance.
see that guy on the left with the playing the tune. So okay, when you listen to like a Native American, like what they're doing is they're doing a constant vibration, and that vibration, I think, is helping this plasma form into a complex plasma. They're helping this plasma initiate that first step into coming into this reality. And so and that specific, those kinds of chants are in every religion. It's not just like Native Americans. It's in every religion. I mean, you have it in, different Christianity. Every time we say, at the end of a song or whatever, it's like, amen, like that kind of stuff. There's always like a tonal frequency that I think that's where all that stuff comes from, is to try to bring in, spirits, because people used to connect with their loved ones. Native Americans called ley lines spirit lines. And they used to connect, they used to think that the dead would enhance the living. The dead would provide them knowledge in some way. And that's where again that Faustian bargain comes in for me too, is that these things or these people who are trying to bring these things in to try to get more information from them, more power, more money, whatever the case is. It'll all be like Cat Williams said, there's God's side and there's the other side, and you're either on the side of truth and God and light, or you're in the darkness. And I think that all the darkness, the light will shine on the darkness for sure. But the point of all that is they put these symbols, they put these spirals in all these movies and stuff too. And those spirals are also very well connected to like pedophilia and things like that, which has been pointed out in like FBI documents. So like if they are sacrificing women and children and men or whatever, then they're doing it in the name of the fallen angels or the entities that are coming through these portals. And again, that's where I think a lot of this stuff comes from.
Yeah, it's strange stuff, man. It really is. Again, I don't know what the whole story is with this, but if people want to learn more about those pictures I just shared, it's the if you just search Ancient Arrow Project, you'll find more information about all that. But yeah, it's strange times to be alive, man. And I wonder from your perspective, I know we're sort of coming to the 2 hour mark, but if you have a little bit more time, I'm curious if you
Sure.
have any thoughts on the current state of the world and maybe even how this plasma is affecting us on a real basis, like all around us. I mean, one example might be these UAPs that are being seen all over the skies. What if this is a plasma phenomena? Because some of the reports go beyond what can be explained with just a physical object, like they're changing shapes, morphing even. And this isn't
Yep.
stuff I've seen on like the internet or podcasts. This is a phone call I had with someone who's in New Jersey who's seeing this stuff and talking to other people at his business who are seeing these things too. So, yeah, it's really strange what's going on in New Jersey. And do you think it's possible that this plasma phenomena could like try to resemble technology, like our technology?
I mean, yeah, I think that's where we're getting technology from. Again, since 1947, during the allegedly during the Roswell crashes and everything. Right after that, President Truman, who was the 33rd president, by the way, um, signed into law the National Defense or the National Security Act, which created the CIA and all these other different branches, right? All these other different administrations and offices and things like that. And that was created 3 weeks later on the Sacred Cow, which was the original Air Force One. And so I think that they were kind of thinking that there was like some sort of an alien attack that was happening then because the Roswell crashes wasn't the only one that happened at that time. There's a lady named Diana Walsh Pasuka or something like that was on Rogan, and she was talking about how there were multiple crashes, and she got to go examine one of the sites. And I think that that's what happened then was people probably thought that there was some sort of a alien invasion or something going on. Then they started kind of working with these entities, it would seem, and then from there on, we started getting all these, allegedly going to space and all this other stuff, right? Getting all this technology, computers and cell phones and all that stuff. It comes pretty quickly. But what I think is happening now is that I think we're going through a great awakening. I think that there is an enlightenment period that we're going through that is sort of waking everybody up to all of this stuff. And as we wake up, we are energetic beings that produce our own little torus field around us. And I think that as we wake up, we produce more light. And as more light is produced, it shines more light on all this stuff that we're seeing. And it disperses these entities and also, again, brings the knowledge of them to light. I don't think that what I'm talking about now is fucking weird, dude, to talk about this stuff because I'm a dummy. I really am. I don't like. I know I can sound smart on this podcast or whatever, and say a bunch of protons and electrons and all ions, all that stuff. But I literally, when I was studying this, I had to go look up what an ion is and what a proton is, and I had to start from the beginning because I don't know shit about anything,
Give
dude.
yourself more credit. We all have to do that in some form or fashion.
Yeah,
We all have
but
to unlearn the school indoctrination, and folks like you and I who stopped after high school, we have a lot less unlearning to do. So yeah, give
yeah,
yourself some credit, man. I was impressed with your presentation, and I definitely wasn't expecting it to go so deep. And it I think it's a layered, the world, the cosmology, however you want to describe it, the creation, I think there's a fractal nature to it, and this helps us understand it on a really structural level. It's almost like they teach us just enough through our basic science class, but they don't go far enough to
yeah.
explain the consciousness, the spiritual phenomena, and all of these, again, strange things can interact with us on this level, both in a physical way, as you described at night when they're cooled in a physical form, or even during the day. I mean, these beings are all around us in a sort of invisible form, and they could be, again, like you said, watching us, manipulating us, and if we engage with them in some sort of ritual form, how do we know they haven't come up with some sort of agenda for us? And now we're just a pawn in their game, right? So, yeah, I think you're bringing up a lot of great points. People from maybe the more alternative, new agey perspective might get a little, up in arms about the Christian perspective on it all, but I think either way, we're all looking at the same phenomena, and we can all learn from each other, even if we don't agree on what it's all about. I myself, through these conversations, have uh, learned so much of what I kind of loosely gathered as a kid. Growing up Catholic, we learn a lot of this stuff about the Bible in catechism, and it just goes out through one ear and out the other because you're a kid and you don't care. And I'm sure it's the same whether you grew up Catholic or Baptist or whatever else, Methodist, whoever else. But yeah, for me, I'm relearning a lot of this stuff, and I appreciate you being open and honest about that. And credit to Tony Merkel for giving you a nudge to be more honest. I don't think there's any shame in being spiritual or having faith or talking about how your faith influences the research you do. I think that's actually even more important because people who are drawing similar conclusions as you are might also want to find that faith as well, and maybe they're missing that piece of it. So appreciate it, man. I really think you should give yourself some credit because you are an armchair scholar, sir. You're a you're a podcast pro at this point.
Well, I think it's in. Did I mute? Hold on one second.
No, you're good. I can hear you.
Okay, yeah. No, I think it's important to like from the new age aspect of things. I look at things from the second coming of Christ might be a collective consciousness rising, and I think that's what happened with us. That's what's happening with us with the Great Awakening. Is that too many things start to not cohere with our reality anymore, from being lied to our faces about elections and viruses and everything else and war. I mean, we could be literally in a war zone and they're on TV are going, we're not in a war at all. So there's something about media and all this stuff that kind of, makes things less coherent in our reality. And as that happens, we become more aware and awake because if you know something is just flat out a lie or blatantly wrong or whatever the case is, and they're trying to tell you another thing, that's the easiest thing to wake up to. Well, a lot of us got to get our heads out of the sand on this, right? And it's like, um, everybody wakes up on their own in their own way. There's a parable of the sower that Jesus talks about in the Bible where you could throw out a bunch of seeds, not all of them will grow. And I think that's what that's what I'm trying to do with my show, the Awaken podcast, is like I'm not trying to wake everybody up. I'm just trying to throw out seeds and every now and then one or two will grow, right? It's like I think that that's what the collective consciousness waking up is just slowly coming to this information and finding something that really resonates and again takes it, because if you see something that, and again you had an experience, right, and it was something that had to happen for you to sort of wake up and to like take action and go, okay, I need to do something about this, or I need to be more interested in this because it doesn't my reality no longer coheres. And I think that's a pretty important thing of what's going on right now is like everybody started leaving their jobs in 2020. They said, no, wait a minute, no, I'm not going to be a hamster on a wheel for you anymore. I'm not going to just take your crap. And then we kind of took the power back from people. We started like, no, I'm going to go work from home and you can pay me this if you want. If not, I'll just go do whatever. Like people, it just woke so many people up that it was like the biggest backfire in the history of backfiring for the people who are living in the darkness and who are worshiping the dark ones. Like that's what I think. Like now it's like the cat is out of the bag. You can't stop the awakening. And so they have to disclose this stuff. They have to talk about it. And they're just going to try to like, brush it under the rug, but they're never going to talk about plasma. They're never going to talk about plasma science. You mentioned school, learning this shit in school. Like, there's a reason why we didn't know that one little piece of information. If we would have known that one little piece of information about what plasma is, then you would have had millions and millions and millions of people thinking about plasma. But you take that out of the equation and you can no longer think about it. You take certain books out of the Bible and you can no longer think about it. If Enoch was talking about portals in the books of Enoch, then let's take that out. There nobody's going to think or talk about these things. They'll just question the validity of the books of Enoch altogether. And that's what they do. They push us to the fringes with all this stuff, but they can't do it anymore because we have collectively taken the power back from them with doing our own media, our own research. We don't, we no longer rely on professors. We are the professors, right? I don't need a professor of certain whatever to come in here and tell me what is what whenever I can read this shit and discern it for myself. I don't respectfully, I don't need a preacher to tell me anything about the Bible whenever I can read it for myself. I don't need anybody to tell me about a lot. I mean, you can learn about ailments yourself, even if you wanted to self-diagnose yourself, which we saw in 2020 was people like, no, screw that. We're going to go find our own medicines and stuff like that and figure this out on our own. Or maybe we're going to just change our diets, or maybe we're just going to stop listening to people who clearly don't have our best interests and hearts in mind whatsoever. So like the biggest media people are kids like Ryan from Ryan's World, the biggest um, archaeologists are people like Graham Hancock, who's a journalist, right? People who are just saying they're questioning the narrative and they're going out and finding ways to um, do this stuff on their own. It's like, no, I can go look in the woods myself. I don't need to trust what a professor's telling me. I don't need to trust what the CDC is telling me. I don't need to trust what the Smithsonian is telling me. I can just figure this shit out on my own. And that's the scariest thing that could happen for them. So I think the Great Awakening is their biggest fear of realizing, of the populace of the world realizing that they are working with demonic forces and they've been controlling us through media and stuff like that for many, many years. And so like when all these CEOs and all this stuff are buying bunkers in New Zealand and all this shit, they're running from us. They're not running from like end of the world shit. They're running from us. That's how I see it, dude. So
Well said, man. Well said, and a great way to close out this podcast. For folks who want more from Brad, the Awakened podcast is available wherever you listen to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. I've been Mystic Mark, and Brad, this has been a fantastic conversation about portals, and more importantly, plasma, I think was really the point of this conversation that's most fascinating. So I look forward to our next conversation. And until then, folks listening, thank you for tuning in. Immerse yourself in the moment wherever you are in the now.